In hypothesis 2 of Plato's Parmenides, Socrates is discussing a unity that also has being, or a one that also has being, as opposed to hypothesis 1, where a unity that does not have being is discussed. Now, suppose we have being as our fundamental principle, our first principle, or our primary reality principle. If that being was self-same, it was isomorphic to itself, then it would also be one thing by default. So my problem is whether we are justified in reifying the concept of unity as a principle to precede being, as the later Platonists do, seemingly. At least the one, Zoen, is hyperousios, so beyond being. Not in the sense of being non-being, but some kind of, transcendent, something that transcends being, which I think has the same problem as non-being. But in any case, I don't think you have to reify the concept of unity if you have a self-same being, because it would be one thing by default without having to, introduce these other things. However, if you put unity as the first principle, you do have to predicate by default that it is. You do have to introduce being into the equation. But in any case, hypothesis 2 makes a virtual distinction between, I'll hold it with this hand, between being and unity, which I do think is interesting. I'm not so sure that Plato means to make an ontological distinction in hypothesis 2, although it is kind of treated like that's the case. But in any case, Aristotle makes a good argument for why they refer to the exact same thing, because one implies the other. Being implies unity for the reason I just gave, essentially. And oneness implies being because you immediately, predicate that you're talking about something and not nothing. So, and that's in metaphysics. As I said, however, the virtual distinction concept is very interesting. Now, the virtual distinction is basically used to arm another argument against Parmenides in the dialogue, against his position against the plurality of beings. Socrates, or I guess really Plato's argument, is that having a one being implies multiple beings, but that's not what we're going to zero in on. What we're going to zero in on is that a virtual distinction between unity, being, implies the distinction of another thing, the difference itself, which kind of creates a basis for triads in general. But further, it creates a basis for all pluralization. It creates a basis for all virtualization of conditions. If we bear in mind that distinction is virtual, then we could see the rest of preceding reality as virtual, in a sense. This is one reason I've always credited the term Maya, although not illusion in the sense that you might think of it. It's not fake, it's necessary. As Plato kind of argues, the plurality is a necessary implication of the unity. It's an explication thereof, which I do agree with. However, it is still virtualized. It's not ontological. This would be my only disagreement. If I'm interpreting it correctly. For all I know, Plato could agree with that. But in any case, this is kind of serving as a preface for my metaphysical model in a nutshell. I'm a monistic idealist, and the essence of my view of reality is that the manifold reality, plural, phenomenal, corporeal reality, is the perception of sets of, I guess we could say, definition, or sets of information, that are being interacted with by subjects. They're being perceived by subjects and rendered as images, rendered there too. And it makes sense that we would have this exterior experience of reality if this were the case, because all definition is relative. It's closer to some things, it's more different to other things. It makes sense that space would be an observation. Space is basically the information of relation. It makes sense that time would be a thing if there are subjects or conscious agents that are interacting with information. It would change, and if they're rendering information, they would be rendering that change. But let's rewind a little bit, because we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. I like this idea of virtualization. I don't think it's actually called that, but I'm projecting it because I like my own use of the word. But let's take this idea of virtualization, and let's suppose that unity is kind of the object. Let's suppose that the first principle is both a subject and an object in a pre-divided manner, in which we're only making a virtual distinction between the two, but in the first principle they are exactly the same. They cannot be ontologically divided. They're the exact same. Unity would be kind of like the metastructure, the object, the way it is. If you have a thing that is, you imply that that thing has a way that it is. Not an explanation for its existence, but a literal way in which it is, right? You are, and you have a way that you are, as opposed to, your neighbor, your dog, whatever. And then we could take being to be the subject. Platonists might get mad at me for kind of just taking, being inspired by the Parmenides, but whatever. Let's go back to the metastructure for a second. The object, the way in which it is, would be the thing that informs all posterior conditions. It would parameterize all virtualizations. So suppose we have this subject-object pre-divided, then we have the first virtual distinction between the subject and object. And we could say that this virtual distinction is inevitable, even. Something that is a necessary explication from the first principle. And this would be kind of like nous, right? Subject turned upon its own object, and in doing so, it would actually virtually distinct the two by looking at itself in a manner of speaking. It would see the way in which it is, and you would have an observer and an observed in a noetic sense. Maybe not a phenomenal sense. And this would be kind of like nous. I think I already said that. But nous, the second hypostasis of Plotinus. So, in any case, you have nous serving as the, as the foundation for continued virtualization. You have this spark of difference, or conceived difference between the subject and its object. The that which is, and the way in which that which is. The metastructure and the agent, so to speak. And from that baseline, you can have continued agents. You would have individuation based off of this subject from the baseline virtualization point, which is nous. Zeroing in on virtualizing continued sets of information. At first, extremely universal, very broad, very general. And these general sets of conditions and definition would be the baseline for further specification or particularity in condition. Particulars would be basically composite sets of information composed from greater numbers of universals, universals relative to their particularity. All of these conditions would be incorporeal. They would be beneath space-time. Space-time would emerge as a registration or a rendering of these conditions to subjects, and all of the conditions would be parameterized by the metastructure of reality. There could be nothing, there could be no thing that could contradict the fundamental way in which reality is. Like, for instance, these trees are parameterized by the metastructure of reality. They can't step outside of those bounds. They have to be within it. This is also why math can work. This is also why one theory works better than another theory. The theory that doesn't work, this is actually a good analogy for the true nature of privation. It's not like one theory is stepping into a different principle that is contrary to the reality principle. It's just not mapping it effectively. So we don't actually have ontological privation. There's no there's no lack of the first principle or the primary reality principle. But in any case, math can work because, and basically any theory can work because it's mapping a way in which reality is to a greater or lesser degree. Not all theories are equal. So I think we've covered those basics well enough. I said in my last video that I would talk about this kind of triune relationship I have modeled between condition, definition, and relation. Condition and definition I usually use interchangeably, so maybe it's just like a dyad, but they're useful for different contexts. But in any case, definition is of course a set of information that is virtualized from the metastructure, and virtualization is a process of isolating a pattern in that metastructure. As soon as that pattern is isolated, it is no longer in itself like concrete. It's virtual because there's no actual particularization of that metastructure ontologically, because there's no privation of it. But in any case, the definition would be the set of information from that virtualization. We inhabit a very particular realm of definition or scale of definition, whereas at first it would have to be incredibly general or universal, like I already went over. All definition is relative. As soon as you have a set of information, you've defined what it is relative to what it is not, relative to what is more proximal to it, relative to what is less proximal to it. I kind of already covered this, but I don't know, I wanted to recap it more because I said that I would, so there we go. Hopefully that's concreted more. However, I could use, this video could use some clarification on the nature of these virtual objects. I also use object interchangeably with a set of information. But we're going to say souls and the conditions that souls inhabit. So I believe that souls individuate basically from, we could say the world soul, or we could say nous. They individuate from the universal soul without diminishing the universal soul whenever there is a new set of information to inhabit. Now, these sets of information, they condition the soul, but they do not reduce the soul to that set of information. The soul at the core is just the same thing as being. It's just involved with a set of information, and this pluralizes being, which gets back into the point I mentioned in Hypothesis 2, is that plurality is implicit. It's an explication of unity in a virtualized sense. Insofar as I am a being, and insofar as you are a being, the being in itself is one thing. It's not multiple things, because in order for it to be multiple things, we have to say that being in itself is has to have the character of say me having curly hair and you probably have straight hair, but then curly hair would have to be in everything, and that's just not how it works. So insofar as we are beings, there's only one principle there. It's the broadest syndiphonic medium, if you're familiar with the CTMU. Speaking of CTMU, Chris Langan is a bodybuilder. No, I'm just kidding. But actually, well, no, he is. But actually, speaking of the CTMU, this individuation without diminution is kind of like what he talks about, what Chris Langan talks about with a distributed manifold, or I don't know if he says mind, being, or tellers kind of are a distributed manifold. So the being unlimited. Maybe I should post Plato's additive and multiplicative argument for why pluralization. Actually, here it is. Here's like the essence of why plurality can stem from unity. It's because you have unity in being implicit in one another, and you virtually have two things, and then you virtually have three things. You have the difference between them as well. And then each of those, you have also at least two things in the being and the unity that you have virtually distincted. You also have another unity in being, and so on. This is Plato's argument in the Parmenides, in Hypothesis 2. This could go on and on. In fact, it does. However, my only nuance would be that this is only a virtual distinction, so reality has to be idealistic or virtual. Well, reality is not, but our experience, corporeality is. Our experience of reality is. So, well, fundamental reality is ideal, but it's not virtual. It's actually real. But anyways, souls condition themselves with information. Of course, the soul has a capacity, a mnemonic capacity, a memory that is baked into what it is. However, it is not reduced to any set of information saturating that memory. That's why the soul is a metastructure. It's a structuring structure. No structure that a metastructure takes on actually changes the nature of the metastructure, if that makes sense. Right, so a soul is a soul is a soul. But a soul can condition itself with different sets of information. And the sets of information that it is conditioned with, the sets of definition, determine its experience of corporeality. Because corporeality is the registration and rendering of that information that the soul is saturated with to itself. It's its perception thereof. Anyways, I think I'm going to cut it off there because we're at about 20 minutes, and I have a tendency to get repetitive. I do not care that these are not professional videos. You do not have to point that out to me, and I know that they're repetitive. I think a little bit of repetitiveness is helpful for really, setting information in, making it impressive. If you like this kind of video, do me a favor, share it, support it with, the minimal effort that it takes. Let me know what points I could probably clarify, because that will hopefully, inform future videos, whether, videos or articles. If you haven't subscribed to my blog, arsphilosophica.com, it is free. It's just an email subscription, okay? I only write there, infrequently. Subscribe to the channel, help me out. I think we can help each other out. I'm a part of your life now, okay? Now, let's have some reciprocity between us. You've listened to me for 20 minutes now. We're in this together, so farewell.